Great. So since we went past the starting time by 10 minutes, so I will have to take this past the end time by 15 minutes, right? Over the past 2 days, right, we have kind of explored a wide range of topics, from historical lessons to collaborations in normalization, from challenges of reconciliations to bilateral relations, from both in the forms of individual and civil society levels, and then from politics, the politics of science, the politics of economics and defense, to questions of earlier today, right, ideologies, discourse, and understanding. So now, the last panel is before the conclusion panel. Last but not least, right, we turn to culture, with 2 excellent papers by Andrew Wellsden and Vinh Pham. Because we're short in time, so you guys can see the profiles. And I would like to call Andrew up first, and then follow that with Vinh.
Great, thanks, Alex Tai. I'd really like to congratulate the organizers, Peter and Pham, and everyone else involved here for putting together such a fantastic day with many different perspectives and bringing all of us together. So in 2021, USAID and the War Remnants Museum, in Ho Chi Minh City, agreed to cooperate on a new exhibition about the legacies of unexploded ordnance and Agent Orange left from the Vietnam War. And this happened during a period of great optimism about the US-Vietnam relationship overall, as we've heard from others yesterday and today, leading up to the comprehensive strategic partnership that was agreed in 2023. And in particular, these 2 issues, UXO and Agent Orange, had once divided the US and Vietnam. They were things, especially Agent Orange, could hardly be talked about in the 1990s and early 2000s. And now they have become the basis for cooperation on war legacies as part of the security relationship between these countries. So when I, as the Mainland Southeast Asia program lead at the U.S. Institute of Peace, became involved in developing the content and design for this new exhibit, I came in, it had already been started for over a year, and I was asked with my team to come in and take it from there and complete this project. And I went into this with my eyes open. I was aware that this was sensitive, that other museum projects like the Norodom Palace exhibit about the Xi'an family have faced a lot of delays and challenges. Several leading foreign scholars of Vietnam, whose judgment I respect, warned me gently that there would be some pitfalls in this. They were right, but not in a way that any of us would have expected. It's not that there was cross-cultural or political conflict between American views and Vietnamese views. There have been different ideas and approaches to the exhibit among the different participants. They haven't always broken down along national lines. What's happened instead this year is events in the United States have called the whole exhibition into question. Is post-war reconciliation and partnership the new normal for Americans and Vietnamese, or is that a period that we've already passed? Like an intermission between phases of more antagonistic US policies, whether they were anti-communist or MAGA. This exhibition is now caught in this uncertainty, and I don't know as of now whether it will be finished or not. So a little bit about the War Remnants Museum. It's the most visited museum in Vietnam. How many people here have been to it? I imagine more than half, okay? A key site of memorialization in Ho Chi Minh City. It's attracted some scholarly attention over the years. because it brings both Vietnamese and international visitors together, and they see a definitely Vietnamese presentation of the war and the suffering that it caused. And authors who have written about the museum have had a wide range of reactions to it. Some people see it as a backward-looking, one-sided presentation of the war where only one side is considered and other views aren't. Pessimistic, brutal, unrepentant are some words that come up in these articles. And there's an assumption that there's a Hanoi-driven political agenda behind the museum, while others have seen it as a space of creativity, innovation, testing boundaries, and looking for new narratives about the war and its aftermath. And probably aspects of both of these are true. I won't get into the details or the history of the museum. There's some of that in the paper. But just a few points to note. The museum is managed by the Ho Chi Minh City Department of Culture, so the City People's Committee, not the Ministry of Culture or someone in Hanoi. And the museum sees itself as having a broader mission. In 2004, the then director of the museum told Christina Schwenkel, quote, "In future projects, the emphasis will be on peace. We plan to include more information on anti-war movements and have a room for peace activities. Our goal is to teach youth about peace, not only war. Down the road, I hope to change our name to the Museum of Peace, but not yet, because there are too many wars in the world right now, and the effects of war are still being felt here in Vietnam." So that name change hasn't happened yet, but it is included in this slogan for the 50th anniversary of the museum at Left. That anniversary happened a few weeks ago. The museum opened in September of 1975. Meanwhile, the museum still displays a lot of US military equipment in its courtyard, as you can see there. For many visitors who are foreign visitors, or the large majority, it's the only location that they go to in Vietnam with a direct focus on the experience of war. And all of these are factors to explain why the leadership of the museum has strongly supported this project with the US. So the proposed permanent exhibition is located on the site of the current Agent Orange exhibit on the second floor of the museum and an adjacent temporary gallery. So it's about a sixth of the total museum area, not a lot of space. Its scope is defined by the museum as, quote, collaboration between Vietnam and the United States in addressing war-related issues, specifically UXO removal, environmental remediation, and support for people with disabilities. Their goal is, quote, to create a modern, engaging exhibit that strengthens the museum's connection to Vietnam's tourist industry, elevates its cultural significance, and fosters US-Vietnam relations. So that's quite an ambitious objective. Even more than that, the senior advisor to the project I've been working with, who's the former director of the Smithsonian-American History Museum in Washington, talks about this as a transformational project to reframe the narrative of US-Vietnamese post-war history as it's presented in Vietnam, and changing the museum itself to more of a focus on a museum for peace. So this shows the sort of structure of the exhibition. It stayed fairly constant over the preparation period. There are 5 sections. There's an introduction that will give a video overview, a series of photos showing Vietnamese and Americans acting together, a map of key locations, and a timeline since 1975. And here's a rendering by the designers of what this is intended to look at when you go in on the left. And then the second section, called Echoes of War, depicts the ongoing effects of the use of Agent Orange and other herbicides and of bombing during the Second Indochina War, using videos, photos, maps, and graphics. And then it shows some stories of Agent Orange and UXO survivors. The third section, called Dialogues Building Trust, tells the story of how the US and Vietnam moved from this blockage on discussions of Agent Orange to very guarded discussions of it, and finally the start of cooperation. And this ends with a narrative and visual depiction here at left of the key breakthrough in cooperation around 2006 to 08 through environmental research on former US military bases in South Vietnam. The largest part of the exhibition is then about the actions and achievements since 2008, cleanup of the 3 largest dioxin hotspots at Da Nang, Phu Quoc, and Bien Hoa, USAID and Vietnamese organizations' assistance to people with disabilities in heavily sprayed provinces in the center and south, UXO survivors, and then UXO and landmine clearance, which includes efforts by the Vietnamese military and by NGOs funded largely by the US State Department. The final part of the exhibition, called Looking to the Future, brings us back to a wider look at US-Vietnam relations and how we can continue to address the remaining effects of Agent Orange and UXO. So that's an outline of the planned exhibit. These are many of the great people I've had a chance to work with on developing it. So that includes the museum staff, US Institute of Peace, USAID, and an expert advisory committee. We met weekly or bi-weekly on Zoom, about quarterly in person over the last few years, through the content revision process, design, and then start of all the official approvals that need to happen. So USIP and the museum found that we could typically agree on about 90% of the comments and questions about content. But the remaining 10% could be really difficult and time-consuming. We had different expectations, different ways of working. For instance, some of the experts of both nationalities felt strongly that MIA cooperation should be included in the scope of the exhibit. Others felt equally strongly it should focus just on Agent Orange and UXO. Some cases because there wasn't space or because that wasn't their bureaucratic mandate. So eventually we worked out that we could include mentions of the MIA program in the timeline and overall thing, but not in the detailed content. So when we have differences, there's no clear way to resolve them. This is a joint project, so it's not the US in charge or Vietnam in charge. No one wants to impose ideas on the other. A lot of decision-making in Vietnam happens through kind of unstated consensus processes rather than a US assumption of the majority taking a vote. And if consensus can't be achieved, there's no decision taken. Things just come to a halt. Or it gets maybe moved up to the higher level in the bureaucracy and they decide. So a lot of the differences that we faced aren't really about the facts or narrative content. It's these cultural assumptions about ways of working and the political processes that we go through to resolve disputes. So cultural assumptions, Vietnamese participants, and I'm generalizing, have been more concerned with the role of government in making history, while Americans have tended to emphasize individual contributions from both countries. The museum has preferred more traditional design ideas, that's what they're familiar with, so like having photos with captions under them, rather than symbolic or representative images with design background effects. The US museum experts that we've consulted have emphasized this is all about the visitor experience, right? It's about going through this and like how you react to it. So it should be as attractive as possible to all the different audiences that come. While the museum staff, like many people in the state system in Vietnam, are quite risk averse, not wanting to take a lot of chances that might be considered sensitive or delay approval. So all of these things have taken a lot of time to work out, but we've been able to stay in dialogue and relationship with each other through the process. There's a lot of goodwill. Everyone's committed to getting the exhibit done. And we were aiming for a mid-2025 opening coinciding with the dual 50th and 30th anniversaries this year. But then US politics threw a wrench in the process. You're familiar with what's happened to US aid and foreign assistance programs generally this year. Actually, Vietnam's fared better than many countries. Everything was suspended at the end of January, but most of the war legacy programs have come back online after some months. That's thanks to a lot of work by US diplomats, supporters in Congress, and consistent messaging from the Vietnamese government, who always emphasizes how important this is to continue. USIP is a nonpartisan institute, but we got caught up in this whole foreign assistance suspension too. It's been a real roller coaster. So this project was suspended. A month or so later, our privately owned headquarters was seized by the so-called Department of Government Efficiency, who then claimed to fire all of our program staff. We filed a lawsuit, which we won in May, so then we came back online and tried to clean up some of the damage. And then at the end of June, the DC Court of Appeals temporarily stayed the district court's decision. So we're back in limbo until the next appeals hearing in November. It's unfortunate that USAID reinstated the War Remnants Museum project in June, just days before that stay. So I was in Vietnam at the time working with the museum to restart the project when this happened. And also at this time, all of USAID's work transferred to the State Department, what was left of it. So specifically the public affairs, public diplomacy, and political sections of the US Embassy in Hanoi and consulate in Ho Chi Minh City. Our colleagues there are really want this to be finished. They're super supportive. They're trying to find ways to do it, but we don't know the outcome yet. This is hugely disappointing to the War Remnants Museum, of course, as well as to all of us who have been involved. And we understand that what the US administration is doing is not about us personally. It's not about the content of this exhibition. It's not about Vietnam, really. It's something domestic. And I think that maybe helps the museum and the Vietnamese government overall to have a restrained reaction to what's been going on this year. Not only aid cuts, but tariff threats, deportations, and so on. There's not a sense of panic. The Vietnamese have pledged to continue commitment to the relationship with the US. They've kept stating their priorities and tried to negotiate. Maybe Vietnamese familiarity with sudden political shifts and authoritarian decision-making has made them more resilient and calmer than Americans who lack this experience. Maybe they know something about the United States that Americans have overlooked. Our past decisions to intervene in Vietnam Civil War, bomb villages, use toxic herbicides, just to take a few examples, are comparable to some of the decisions being made during the current regime. So maybe we should view the US denial of responsibility for the effects of Agent Orange and bombing after 1975 as a pattern, not an aberration. Of course, Vietnamese are also aware that there have always been some Americans in and outside of government who have pursued more conciliatory and cooperative policies, but those views won't prevail all the time. And I was struck by the description of bipolar US behavior in Tao's presentation just before this. But despite these contradictions and shifting winds, the War Remnants Museum and the Vietnamese generally are committed to partnership with the US. The question is, are we? And whether we can still tell this transformative story to visitors to the museum remains to be seen. Thanks.
Next we have Vinh Pham. Vinh.
Hi everybody, thanks for staying. So I'm here to talk to you about literature. So it's a little lighter in some ways. And so on April 30th this year, the streets of Ho Chi Minh were eclectic, or electric. Young people and old people have been preparing for the 50th celebration at the end of the Vietnam War for months. Red and yellow banners with socialist iconography and pictures of smiling Uncle Ho hung high throughout the city, seeming to usher in a new era of peace and promised prosperity. The celebration also included a military parade and troops marching, tanks, fighter jets flying above, boasting Vietnam's ramped-up nationalism and pride rarely seen, with the exception of soccer game victories, which also don't happen quite often. That one right there, the little kids in the tank, was taken in Hanoi, actually, this summer when I was there. Abroad, feelings are mixed. Of course, sorry. There's another one. This is also in Saigon. This is me next to Lenin and Marx. I thought it was cute. It looks like they're in a couple. So abroad, feelings are mixed. Just a little bit. Feelings are mixed as both large swaths of the diasporic population, especially in the United States, still holds resentment towards the country's government. For a country whose name is synonymous with war, and to think of Vietnam in relation to peace is not necessarily a contradiction in terms, but a radical shift in the way that the country has been depicted in Western media. For those familiar with the country and its post-war development since 1975, the now oft overstated economic policies, these efforts to shift the narratives do not go unnoticed. The Vietnamese diaspora is perhaps one of the most vocal and culturally productive ethnic groups who are not generally shy to talk about or criticizing the Vietnamese state, and at times scathingly and passionately so, as we've sort of witnessed. This is especially noted in Vietnamese-American literature, where some of the most famous works by Vietnamese-American authors deploy the perilous journey of diaspora, either by boat or by plane, as the sui generis for their narratives. If you think of any three famous Vietnamese-American authors and their works, and suddenly the trend, the thematic similarity becomes kind of apparent. Collapse of the country, internment camps, clandestine escape, difficulties of exile, and perpetual alienation. Rinse, wash, and repeat. This is less about navel-gazing and the repetition for itself, and it's about the lasting impact that the war had, which ripped the country apart, destroyed countless families, and affected millions of Vietnamese and everyone else involved. In other words, it isn't the case that Vietnamese writers have nothing else to talk about, but that there is so much to unravel and explore as the shadow of the war still lingers across generations. However, will this always be the case the further we get away from it? So my research questions are as follows. How has Vietnamese-American literature evolved since the emergence of the aftermath of the Vietnam War? What accounts for this shift in Vietnamese literary corpus? And how do contemporary authors like Ocean Vuong and Thao Thai engage in the Vietnam War while also moving beyond it? And what does this literary evolution suggest about the possibilities of thinking about peace between the US and Vietnam? So my thesis is kind of simple. The paper aims to examine the possibility of this shift through the works of the two authors I've just mentioned, particularly on how they continue to evoke the Vietnam War and its aftermath, but they do so in a way that signals a critical shift in the war's narrative centrality from what we've seen previously. And so to think about these questions, I propose to sort of divide up the corpus into three eras, which I'll show you. So the first era is what I call the period one. We have the refugee canon, right, from 1975 to the mid-2000s, or I would say early 2000s. Yeah. And so they're reducible mostly to the fall of Saigon, refugee resettlement, and obviously the Republic of Vietnam comes in quite heavily. And then these are sort of the more emblematic works. It's not exhaustive. Right. So the main features you're noticing is gratitude, rescue narrative, good refugee, anti-communist politics, and testimonial urgency. So which is why they often come in the form of memoir. Then the second period, I call this the sort of transitional experimental phase of the early 2000s to mid 2010s. And so here we have with US-Vietnam normalization, you have Vietnam joins the World Trade Organization and the rise of new media, like all of these streaming services that allows people to access information more readily, so you're not smuggling things into Vietnam anymore. Right? So we get a new kind of excitement for experimentation. So things like Monkey Bridge, Book of Salt, The Gangsters We're All Looking For, they're starting to become what we understand now as sort of literary literature and not necessarily as a sort of testimonial or memoir style literature of the earlier period, right? And so here we're starting to push against the war centrism, experiments with new forms, and I would say probably Book of Salt is the one that moves further away from all of that. So then now we're in the current period, right, which is the last period for me, around the 40th and 50th anniversary of the war. So US-trained diplomatic ties is like well established now, and Vietnam is becoming this globalized hub. So we start to see more poetry, hybrid memoir, popular fiction, Gothic novels, so on and so forth. So the war is still there. The war doesn't ever really go away, right? But it no longer is like this other character that sits inside a lot of these pieces. So you have things like the sympathizer. Wait, Vinh, what are you talking about? That whole thing's about the war. Yes and no, right? Yes, it uses the war as a sort of backdrop, but it's actually, to me, right, it's about genre writing. And so then we also have On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, and then Vinh. Also, just out of curiosity, how many of you actually read On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous? Yay, okay. So we all know more or less what is at stake and what we're talking about. Okay, so if you haven't read it, this is sort of the summary. It's unnecessary to rehearse Frederick Jameson's now infamous assertion that all third world literature operates as a national allegory. Still, it's difficult to overlook the extent to which Vietnamese-American literature remains tethered to the allegorical form, especially as it emerges at the intersection of displacement, diaspora, and global capitalism. At the same time, it's crucial to note that all the writers in question are unequivocally American. The invocation of third worldist aesthetics and concerns cannot be reduced to geography alone, but instead reflects a period of political affinity and orientation that is shaped by exile, critique, and a cultural memory, which marks their work at once unquestionably refugee literature. Okay. In terms of the, let's go back. So in terms of Vietnamese-American canon, Ocean Vuong's On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous is not simply about a novel about the Vietnam War. On one level, the conditions of Little Dog, his name is Da Cong, right, so it's Little Dog. Little Dog's life, his refugee status, his family's economic precarity, their marginalization from American norms of success, can certainly be traced back to the war's aftermath. But on another level, his queerness, which has shaped much of the novel's emotional and political texture, resists and complicates dominant narratives of refugee assimilation. In this way, Vuong introduces a powerful counterpoint to the model minority figure. Instead of an immigrant ready for integration into the imperial state, we encounter a subject marked by vulnerability, refusal, and excess. As Jennifer Cho argues, Vuong's continued engagement with and juxtaposition of multiple families in his novels, representing both immigrant Vietnamese and white heterosexual identities, then reveals how the US nationalist ideologies are bent on reproducing paradigms of whiteness and heteronormativity. Yet in the novel, rarely does the reader encounter a success story in terms of this social reproduction. Most of the people you encounter in the novel actually don't do very well for themselves. Even Trevor, the emblematic, impossibly American white boy with whom Little Dog forms a romantic bond, emerges as a product of structural failure, right? He's coming out of a broken home, living in a trailer, and his parents or his dad is single parent addicted to meth. His experience of paternal abuse complicates this possibility, rendering him not simply as a beneficiary of dominant systems, but a figure through which the fractures of whiteness, masculinity, and heteronormativity are laid bare. Trevor is Little Dog's entry into a kind of American life that is often neglected in the story of America, of broken homes and families where little boys learn about love and life, not from their parents, since they're mostly left unsupervised, but on the edges of town. but from their and on the edges of town, from where their innocent exploration of and one another, with and of one another. In one of the scenes, Trevor puts on a World War II helmet after having smoked cocaine-laced weed. Again, these boys are like teenagers. And the boys begin to listen to the radio, where Trevor then explains how football works to Little Dog. During this scene, Little Dog asks Trevor, "Are we close?" referring to the touchdown, but also unknowingly deploying the American euphemism for their sexualized encounter. To which Trevor replies, "Yeah, I think we got this." Also unaware of their youthful indiscretion and the passage's predictable climax. Here, Trevor and his World War II helmet, the radio playing, the laced cigarettes, and the summer heat with the salty sweat dripping from their bodies, the boys experience replicate the well-worn images and tropes of American GIs in Vietnam. Presented with sex, violence, and the confounding experience of being thrust into a world with little guidance towards that unknown, Loon's description gestures towards the scenes that are reminiscent of Vietnam, even when they are not explicitly about the war. This passage, overwrought with sex and innocence, looks not towards history, but rather the sensations to which the very historical memory is built. You know, the same kind of imagery you get from watching any like Vietnam War movies. It's usually some scene in Saigon where everybody's like hot and bothered. So then the next piece that I have here is Van and Moon. Has anybody read this one? This one's very new. So the other one's quite famous, but this one's very, very new. And so, I mean, one of the things that I would say mark these writers differently from the other ones is there is a sort of compulsion towards writing, but these are MFA trained writers, which is to say these are a deliberate and kind of expensive way into going to this and seeing it as a real career choice, right? Rather than becoming a lawyer and then also writing a novel on the side, which is the case for some of our community members. So similarly, in Thao Thai's debut novel, Ban Ye Moon, while the Vietnam War rumbles in the background, it is indeed American life and the differentiated stages of integration and assimilation of each generation that is at the center of the novel. Set in a sleepy town near the Florida Gulf Coast, the novel tells the story of 3 Vietnamese women. Anne, the most American of the 3 characters, is a successful illustrator who lives in Michigan, who abandons her life with her partner Noah, a college professor from a wealthy white family, to come back to live in Florida with her mom, Pham. Anne's return to Florida is prompted by her finding out that her grandmother Ming, with whom she had a much better relationship, has passed away. Right? So it's sort of a return journey, except the return here is Florida and not Vietnam. Anne is to co-inherit the house with her mother, much to the chagrin of her uncle Phu, her mom's brother, who believes that the house rightly belongs to him, right? So we have some stereotypical tropes of inheritance after like traumatic experiences and families infighting, which is also not atypical for Vietnamese narratives. During much of the novel, Phuc is seen as the male outcast of the family and appears only in flashes as a second figure who does not wish to be a part of their family. Anne's return home is further complicated by her pregnancy with Noah's child. Throughout the novel, the Gothic house functions as a symbolic nexus of family and nation, haunted by painful memories, deteriorating under the weight of unresolved conflict and neglect, and ultimately it gets consumed by a fire. So thematically, Ban Ye Moon shares many of the same similarities as On Earth Were Gorgeous. Both texts have an outcast character who feels separated from their families. Both emphasize the intergenerational divide between those who lived and were directly afflicted by the war, and those whose main challenges are finding their place within American life and then born in the US. For Anne and Little Dog, their grandmother, because they've seen too much, becomes the main mediator between them and their traumatized mothers. The 2 novels also share similar narrative structures, preferring non-linear movements between past and present. Similar to Little Dog's mother, whom, you know, is kind of a literary, like alliteration-ish, whom, also suffers from an abusive relationship with Anne's dad, Vinh, and eventually manages to separate from him, and they flee the Banyan house and to seek shelter with the grandmother. Like Pham, who never really manages to find love again, and even though she continually runs into the gentleman who tries to court her, stating, "If I can survive a riptide, I can certainly survive some time without a man." For all 3 women, the Banyan house is both a refuge and an extension of their familial bond, where there are still nooks out of reach, too hidden to be fully explored, and this is most represented by the attic, right? Where critters made themselves welcome, and the wildest of all the untamed corners of the house, which is written to feel spooky, if not haunted. Building on the Southern Gothic tradition, Thai's novel's usage of the swamps of Florida, a place marked well below the Mason-Dixie as a geographic signaling towards old air and social decay, an apt framing for women whose tattered lives are well beyond proper repair. Lovers of William Faulkner might recognize similar themes of relatable but flawed characters, eerie, decrepit settings, rural poverty, and supernatural elements. The rupture of South Vietnam and these women's lives, in other words, are supplanted into the long history of a ruptured American South. Yet, unlike more traditional American Gothic, such as The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson or Toni Morrison's masterful Black Gothic novel Beloved, which tend to offer no final solace, in Banyan Moon, because it is still an immigrant story and a refugee story, there are inklings of hope. In one of the scenes, as Anne gazes towards the Banyan house, contemplating about the future life of her unborn child, she states, "Here, outside the house, all of the history holding us back, I describe the small fluttering of hope I feel, along with the dread of raising a child on my own." For these women, they know that holding on to history is a burden, but to inherit it as mother and daughter is not simply to abandon it, but to interrogate it and to make it their own. The futurity represented by the child soon to be born cannot be ethically or fully considered if the structural elements of the house, the history on which it is built, is not approximated and thoroughly renovated, right? So there's sort of this responsibility towards future generations. So after coming to terms with this reality, Anne then had wires installed for Wi-Fi, which she then says would allow her to connect to the outside world, something she knew that she needed. The attic also holds a chest, which Anne cannot open, and thus for much of the story, the entirety of the house, its contents, its stories, remain a mystery to her, prompting her to ask, but who does any of this belong to now? The living must trespass on the dead, everything left behind a gift, an inheritance, no matter how unintentional. So during the final scenes, when the house is consumed by flames, possibly started by Phu, Minh, speaking from the dead, tells the reader, "I see the Banyan house for what it is, a home for women, a shaggy, worn, and vicious protector of the bruised, the tender. We grew up in that house, and in turn, it grew inward on us. It could tolerate us no less than our devotion, even in death, and when we began to not need it, it crumbled. A mirage of what could not sustain itself without pain." Taking an aesthetic departure from Vuong's text, where death seems final, Banyan Moon tries to take advantage of the full Gothic genre by imbuing elements of the supernatural. As Margaret Davison notes in her study of the Southern Gothic tradition, in the American tradition, the house becomes an anthropomorphized, effectively assuming a life in its own in a form of sentience and agency. Indeed, Min's literal ghostly narration serves as a bridge, a witness, and it stands in for what the house itself cannot say. In recognizing this, as their home burns, Phuong cries out, "The house! Man is in the Banyan house," to which Min's ghost replied, "No, Kang, I'm not." Indeed, the house is not Min, and she herself insists, but a broken dream of what is to be a shared place could have been, grounding the structure of their own broken family, a placeholder for provisional life of refugees before they settle in the ashes and start their lives anew. So this is my conclusion. So part of the reason these two novels are particularly apt for reflecting on the current moment is that they're also rooted in the biography of the authors. Vuong and Thai represent different trajectories of the Vietnamese diaspora. Vuong's upbringing in New England shapes the industrial and emotional landscape, where the cold bloom of the East Coast reflects the novel's post-industrial affect. It isn't about Vietnamese refugees. It isn't just about Vietnamese refugees. But it's also about racialized politics in American life, where whiteness in the case of Trevor and his father cannot be presumed, even for those who might technically fit the racial category. Thai, by contrast, is a Midwestern writer and a relative of Pham Kim, by the way. I did not know that. A prominent South Vietnamese diplomat, writer, and intellectual. Her character, Anne, reflects on the Midwest sensibility, and it also fractures it by grounding the novel in domestic tension rather than rural Gothic atmosphere of Florida's Gulf Coast. So ultimately, I mean, there's more that we can say during the question and answers, but ultimately, literature to me may influence heart and mind, but it cannot itself dismantle systems of power, and this is one of its core limits. No novel, no matter how beloved, can on its own stop the expansion of the surveillance state, reverse imperial wars, or guarantees justice for the displaced. Art cannot negotiate treaties and trade embargoes or dissolve authoritarian regimes. The geopolitical terrain shaped by diplomacy, economic alliances, and hard power operates on a scale that literature can critique, but it cannot control. And while I hold the belief that literature can change the world through its ability to shape perception, cultivate empathy, and reframe historical understandings, it would be naive or overly optimistic to suggest that art alone can rectify the material conditions of global politics. The power of literature is symbolic and effective, and sometimes it can lead to something legislative. But that is not the main raison d'etre. Less, we want to kill everything that makes art art in the first place. And I certainly don't want to read any literature with a political project from any community, much less from the Vietnamese one. And in this way, this latter period of Vietnamese-American literature can imagine peace, and it can make space for introspection and interrogation, but it cannot enforce it. Thank you.